Hi, my name is Julia, and this is my informative speech over the body's coping mechanisms when in a state of shock. So the first thing I want to point out is that coping mechanisms come in different forms. They can be both positive and negative. But the first thing I want to lead with also is that, did you know that 26% of children under the age of 4 experience trauma? And I thought that was a very big number because a lot of the population is children, and I wanted to kind of dig in deeper on what kind of trauma and how do they deal with that as they grow older into adulthood. And I found it really interesting. So the first shock I want to talk about is psychological shock. This can happen over a long period of time. It can be an isolated incident. It can happen anytime in your life, childhood all the way into adulthood. So the example I wanted to use today was sexual abuse or sexual assault. The victim usually puts up a emotional block within themselves so that way they don't feel the extent of what has happened to them. Usually when you're a child going into a teenager, you're not emotionally mature, your brain is still developing, so you're not really sure how to handle it or how to deal with it, and this is why they turn towards drinking or doing drugs just to kind of help them cope with the incident and get on with their day-to-day life. The second trauma I want to talk about is a physical trauma. It can be something as a car accident. You know, that can be minor as cuts and bruises, maybe a broken bones, to something grave as them dying on impact, them dying on the way to the hospital, them dying in the ambulance. So for example, let's take a drunk driver versus, another car. That drunk driver is usually going to be going more than likely at a high speed. It's going to be a direct hit to the other car more than likely, and that person in the other car is going to suffer massive blood loss, especially if their car is going at a high speed too. That in and of itself is a shock. It's called hypovolemic shock. It's when your body has little blood and fluids to pump to your heart, to the rest of your organs. Your BP, your blood pressure will drop also, and that in turn affects your heart. So it's really just a cycle of things that happen. And usually your body will try to fight it, but if it's something that you have a lot of things going on, more than one thing going on in your body, it's usually not going to be able to, so that's why a lot of people do die. And sometimes, or more than likely, they will die before they even get to the hospital because impact from both cars at high speeds usually really is pretty severe. The last shock I want to talk about is emotional shock. This can be grief. For example, when a loved one dies, whether it's out of the blue or they have cancer or just kind of anything, it's really their death in particular with somebody you're emotionally attached to, emotionally close with. This can cause depression in the person, despair, anxiety. This affects their environment, so the way they see things, the way people see them. Their social interaction usually decreases during this period of time because they just don't want to see anybody. It affects the way they act towards themselves, towards others. And usually they start feeling those feelings of denial or avoidance when somebody dies. And that's usually a big emotional trauma. I want to point out that these types of shocks, there is not one that is greater than the other, that is worse than the other. It really depends on the person and their experience and how they choose to react or not react, because like I said, mechanisms can be both positive and negative. There's not a right or wrong one, and there's not really a time frame on it either. Like I said, it's up to the person on what they want to do to help them feel better and cope with their type of shock, their type of trauma, and for how long they want to do it. Like I said, drugs and drinking are going to be the ones that are going to affect your body and your mind the most. And then there's other ones like turning towards faith or turning towards other people or just different things, maybe things that I've never even heard of before. But I just wanted to say that. And I also wanted to say thank you guys for listening. And I hope you'll have a great day.